Find a comfortable place if you can. Settle in and let the day slip away. This is a story for the quiet hours, for when the world outside grows still, and the only sounds are the creak of a floorboard or the soft hum of a night lamp. My voice will be your guide, but you don't have to follow every word. You can let your mind wander, let the images form behind your eyes like photographs developing in a dark room slowly, without rush. We are going to travel back in time, not to a place of battles or kings, though kings will appear, but to a world of water and mud and muscle. We are going to the Grand Canal in China, and we are going to meet the people who built it, who lived on it, who breathed its damp air and called its towpaths home. Now, if you have ever seen a canal, perhaps in your own town or on a holiday, you know it is not a dramatic thing. It is a simple cut in the earth, filled with still water. It has locks and bridges and barges that move with a sleepy slowness. But the Grand Canal of China is not like a canal you have seen. It is not a small ditch for pleasure boats. It is a river of history, a spine of stone and silt that runs for more than 1,000 miles, from Beijing in the north to Hangzhou in the south. It was built over centuries, piece by piece, by hands that have long since turned to dust. And those hands, the hands of the workers, are what we are going to think about tonight. Let us begin by easing into the mood. Imagine it is a late evening, the kind where the sky is a deep purple and the air is cool on your skin. You are standing on the bank of the Grand Canal, somewhere in the middle of its long journey. The water before you is dark and smooth, like a length of black silk stretched across the land. There are no lights along the shore, except for the occasional lantern on a passing boat. The boat moves without a sound, its hull cutting through the water with a gentle hiss. You can hear the lapping of waves against the mud, the distant call of a night bird, and perhaps, if you listen very closely, the low murmur of voices. Those voices belong to the canal workers. They are the ones who keep this water highway alive. Now, to understand how these workers lived, we must first understand what the Grand Canal meant to China. It was not just a waterway, it was a lifeline. For over 2,000 years, since the time of the early emperors, the rulers of China needed to move grain from the fertile south to the hungry north. The north had the capital, the soldiers, the grand palaces. The south had the rice, the silk, the tea. And so they dug a canal. But this was not a single event. Each dynasty added its own section, its own locks, its own stories. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, around the 1400s, the canal was a vast system of rivers, lakes, and man-made channels, linking the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze River in the south. It was the longest canal in the world, and probably the busiest. Imagine the scene: thousands of boats, from tiny fishing skiffs to enormous grain barges, all moving in a slow, choreographed dance. On the banks, mules and men pulled the boats along the towpaths. In the locks, crews of workers opened and closed the gates, releasing water with a thunderous roar. And at night, these workers would rest. They would find a patch of ground or a corner of a boat, and they would sleep, lulled by the sound of water. But who were these workers? They were not a single group. Some were farmers who worked on the canal during the dry season when the fields needed less attention. Others were soldiers assigned to canal duty as part of their service. And many were simply poor people, landless peasants, who had no other way to make a living. They came from all over China, from the villages along the canal, and from farther away. They brought with them their dialects, their customs, their recipes for simple food. They lived in makeshift communities that shifted with the seasons. A canal worker's home might be a thatched hut on the bank, built from reeds and mud. Or it might be a small boat that served as both home and workplace. The boat would be cramped, smelling of wood smoke and river water, with a tiny stove for cooking and a bamboo mat for sleeping. There was no privacy. You ate, worked, and slept within earshot of your neighbors. But this closeness also created a kind of family. The canal workers looked after one another. They shared their meals, their stories, their jokes. And they had their own songs, slow and melodic, that they sang as they pulled the ropes. Let us drift into a specific scene. It is a hot summer day, perhaps in the late 1600s. The sun is high, and the air is thick with humidity. A group of workers is gathered near a lock, waiting for a barge to pass. They are not idle, they are repairing a section of the towpath that has been washed out by rain. One man is digging mud with a wooden spade. Another is carrying stones on his back. A third is weaving a rope from strips of bamboo. They work slowly, with a steady rhythm, as if they have all the time in the world. And in a way, they do. Their lives are measured not by hours or minutes, but by the rising and falling of the water. They stop for a meal of rice and pickled vegetables, eaten from a clay bowl with their fingers. They splash water on their faces to cool off. They complain about the heat, but without anger, more like a familiar friend. Then they go back to work. The sun moves across the sky. The barge passes through the lock, its crew waving. The workers wave back. It is a small moment, unremarkable, but it is the fabric of their lives. Now, I must tell you that the life of a canal worker was not easy. It was hard, physical labor, day after day. The work was dangerous, too. Locks could break. Ropes could snap. The water could rise suddenly during a storm. And the diseases that spread along the canal, dysentery, malaria, cholera, could take a worker in a matter of days. But I do not want to dwell on the darkness. Not tonight. Because these workers, despite the hardship, found ways to make their lives bearable, even joyful. They had festivals. On the Dragon Boat Festival, they would hold races on the canal, their barges decorated with flags. They would eat sticky rice dumplings wrapped in lotus leaves. They would gamble on the outcome, laughing and shouting. On the new year, they would take a break from work, gather in the largest hut, and share a feast of fish and pork. They would burn incense to the canal gods, asking for a safe year ahead. And they would tell stories of the canal's creation, of the demons that lived in the deep water, of the heroes who had built the locks. These stories were passed down from one generation of workers to the next, like a secret language. One such story is about a man named Chen, who was a lock keeper in the Ming Dynasty. According to the tale, Chen was a silent, watchful man. He lived alone in a small stone house next to the loch, with only a dog for company. Every morning at dawn, he would open the gates of the loch, letting the water rush in. Then he would wait. He would sit on a stool, whittling a piece of wood, and watch the boats pass. He knew every captain, every cargo. He could tell by the way a boat sat in the water how much grain it carried. He could tell by the color of the sail where it had come from. The captains respected him. They brought him gifts, a jar of wine, a piece of silk in exchange for a quick passage. Chen would accept the gifts without a word and then let them through. This scene played out for decades until Chen grew old and his hands trembled. One night, a great storm came. The water in the canal rose dangerously high. Chen went out to close the lock gates, but a wave knocked him off his feet. He was swept into the loch and drowned. The next day, the workers found his body, and they buried him on the bank. They say that on stormy nights, you can still see his ghost, sitting on the lock gate, whittling his piece of wood. It is a sad story, but the workers told it with a kind of affection. Chen was one of them. His ghost was a guardian. Let us move to another aspect of their lives, the food. When you think of Chinese cuisine, you might think of elaborate dishes, of spices and sauces. But the food of the canal workers was simple, hearty, and cheap. Rice was the base, of course. They cooked it in large iron pots, stirred with a wooden paddle. To the rice, they added whatever they could find. Dried fish from the canal, salted vegetables from the market, bits of pork when they could afford it. They would wrap these ingredients in a bamboo leaf to make a portable package called a zongzi, which they could take with them on the towpath. They drank tea, strong and green, from chipped cups. And they drank wine, a rough rice wine that warmed them on cold nights. They did not have the luxury of fine dining, but they ate together, sitting in a circle, their bowls touching. This was their communion. And then there was the water itself. The canal water was not clean. It was used for washing, for drinking, for waste. The workers knew this. They could see the sediment swirling in their cups, but they had little choice. They learned to boil the water first, to add tea leaves to mask the taste. They suffered from stomach ailments, but they accepted it as part of their life. They had a saying, "The canal gives us our living, and the canal gives us our sickness." It was a bargain they made. Now, I want you to imagine the soundscape of the canal. It is night again, and you are lying in a hut, trying to sleep. The walls are thin, made of woven reeds. Outside, you can hear the water lapping against the bank. It is a soft, constant sound, like a lullaby. You can hear the creak of a boat's mooring line, the faint splash of a fish. You can hear the distant barking of a dog, and then, from somewhere down the canal, the sound of a man singing. It is a work song, a song the boatmen used to coordinate their pulling. The melody is slow, almost mournful. The words are old, from a time before memory. You cannot understand them, but the feeling is clear. It is a song of longing for a home far away, for a life that is not this one. The song drifts over the water and then fades. You close your eyes. The night is deep. In the morning, life resumes. workers wake before dawn, when the air is still cool and the stars are just fading. They make a small fire, boil water for tea, and eat a quick breakfast of leftover rice. Then they go to their tasks. Some will walk the towpath, leading mules that pull the barges. This is a slow, steady walk, hour after hour. The mules plod along, their hooves making a soft thud on the dirt. The worker walks beside them, holding a switch, but rarely using it. He talks to the mule in a low voice, a one-sided conversation. He tells the mule about his wife, his children, his dreams. The mule does not answer, but it seems to understand. They are partners in this work. Other workers are stationed at the locks. A lock is a simple device, a chamber with gates at both ends. A boat enters the lock, the gates are closed, and the water level is raised or lowered to match the next section of the canal. This requires a team of workers to turn the capstans, which operate the gates. It is heavy work, requiring several men to push against the wooden spokes. They do it in rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2. One of them calls out a count. The others grunt in response. When the gate opens, the water rushes in or out, and the boat moves on. Then they close the gate and wait for the next boat. This is repeated dozens of times a day. It is monotonous, but the workers find ways to make it interesting. They tell jokes. They play guessing games. They complain about the officials who oversee the canal, who rarely visit, but always demand a share of the grain. The officials were a constant presence, even if they were absent. The canal was owned by the emperor, and everything that moved on it was taxed. The workers were paid by the state, but the pay was low and often late. They had to bribe the local magistrates to keep their jobs. They had to pay for their own tools, their own food, their own medicine. It was an unfair system, but the workers accepted it. They had seen worse. In times of famine, the canal was a refuge. The workers were at least fed, at least housed. They had a community. Let me tell you about a particular worker named Liang. Liang was a rope puller on the canal for 40 years. He started as a boy, maybe 12 years old, walking beside his father. He learned how to tie the knots, how to balance on the muddy bank, how to read the water for signs of danger. When his father died, Liang took his place. He married a woman from a nearby fishing village, and they had 3 children. They lived in a hut on the bank, with a small garden of vegetables. Liang would leave before dawn, walk to the boat, and pull until sunset. He would come home exhausted, his shoulders raw from the rope. His wife would wash his wounds with salt water and put him to bed. He would sleep like the dead. But in the evenings, on feast days, Liang would play a bamboo flute. He had a talent for it. The other workers would gather around, and Liang would play songs that made them laugh and cry. He was not a famous man. He did not make history, but he lived a full life by his own measure. And that is the heart of this story. The canal workers were not heroes in the grand sense. They did not lead armies, write poems, or govern provinces. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, but in an extraordinary place. They were shaped by the water, as much as the water was shaped by them. They left no monuments, except for the canal itself. And even the canal has changed now. Modern barges are motorized. Locks are automated. The towpaths are empty, overgrown with grass. The songs have faded. But if you go there to the Grand Canal on a quiet night, you might still feel their presence. The water still laps. The moon still rises. And somewhere in the mud and the reeds, the memory of those workers lingers. Now, let us move into the deep history. The Grand Canal was not built at once. It began in the 5th century BC, when a Chinese kingdom dug a short canal for military transport. Over the next 1,000 years, various emperors added sections. But the great expansion happened in the Sui dynasty around 600 AD. The emperor Yang of Sui had a vision of a unified China with a single waterway connecting north and south. He conscripted millions of workers to dig the canal. They worked under brutal conditions. Many died. They dug with their hands, with shovels, with picks. They carried the earth away in baskets. They built locks, bridges, and embankments. The work went on for years, until the canal stretched over 1,000 miles. Emperor Yang was not a kind man. He was ruthless, ambitious. But he built the canal, and his workers paid the price. But we are not focusing on the emperor tonight. We are focusing on those workers. How did they live during this massive construction? They lived in tent cities, rows upon rows of temporary shelters. The work sites were dangerous. The ground was unstable. Diseases spread like fire. The workers had no medical care. They died and were buried in shallow graves along the canal. Their bodies became part of the earth, and yet the work continued. It had to. The emperor would accept no delay. One historian wrote that the workers sang as they dug, but the songs were sad. They sang about the beauty of their home villages, which they would never see again. They sang about the cold winter nights when the ground froze and their fingers cracked. They sang about the hope that their labor would be remembered, that their children would be proud. After the Sui dynasty fell, the canal fell into disrepair. But later dynasties rebuilt it, improved it. The Tang dynasty made it a major trade route. The Song dynasty added locks that could raise boats over hills. The Ming dynasty created a system of reservoirs to control the water levels. Each generation of workers added their own layer of effort. The canal became a living thing, growing and changing with the centuries. Now consider the daily routine of a Ming dynasty canal worker, say in the year 1500. The worker wakes in his hut, a structure of packed mud and thatch. The hut has one room with a dirt floor. In one corner, a stone hearth for cooking. In another, a pile of straw for sleeping. There is no furniture, just a few wooden boxes for clothes and tools. The worker puts on his tunic and trousers, both made of rough cotton, patched many times. He steps outside. The air smells of river mud and smoke. He sees the long line of huts stretching along the bank. He sees children playing by the water, their mothers calling them for breakfast. He sees the boats already moving, their sails catching the first light. He walks to the work site, where a foreman gives him his assignment. Today, he will help repair a leaking lock gate. He picks up his tools, a saw, a hammer, a bucket of pitch, and he begins. The repair work is slow. The gate is old, the wood waterlogged. He and his team must remove the old planks, cut new ones, fit them into place, and seal the seams with pitch. They work in the water up to their waists. It is cold. The pitch is sticky and hot. They sing as they work, a rhythm to keep time. One man leads, the others follow. The song is about a fisherman who caught a golden fish, but the fish spoke and warned him of a storm. It is a nonsense song, but it makes the work easier. By noon, they have replaced 3 planks. They stop to eat. They sit on the bank, their feet in the water, and eat rice and steamed fish. They drink tea from a common pot. They rest for an hour, lying in the shade of a willow tree. Then they go back to work. By evening, the gate is repaired. The foreman inspects it, nods, and sends them home. They are tired but satisfied. A job well done. They return to their huts, wash in the canal, and eat a simple dinner. Then they sit outside, talking in low voices, watching the stars. Then they sleep. This routine might seem dull to us, but for the workers, it had a rhythm that was calming. They did not worry about the future. They lived in the present. They were connected to the earth, to the water, to each other. They had no clocks, no calendars. They measured time by the seasons, by the height of the water, by the journey of a boat. This slowness, this acceptance, is something we have lost, and perhaps that is why their story is so soothing to think about. Now, I want to share a specific detail about the workers' watercraft. Many of them owned small boats called sampans. These boats were their homes, their transport, their livelihood. A sampan is a simple flat-bottomed boat, usually with a bamboo awning for shelter. The worker would live on the sampan with his family. They would cook, sleep, and eat on the boat. They would tie it to the bank at night. The sampan would rock gently with the current. The family would hear the water against the hull, a sound that became like a heartbeat. On a sampan, there was no privacy. You slept in the same space where you worked, where you ate. But there was also a feeling of freedom. You could untie the rope and drift anywhere. You could follow the food, follow the work. You were not tied to the land. The sampan community was tight-knit. Families would tie their boats together to form floating neighborhoods. Children would jump from boat to boat. Women would share cooking pots. Men would gather on the largest sampan to play cards or bones. On festival days, they would deck the boats with lanterns, and the canal would become a river of light. They would float down the canal, singing and laughing. It was a beautiful sight, but there was also a shadow side. The workers were vulnerable to bandits. Bandits would attack the canal boats, stealing grain and coins. The workers had no protection. They would hide their valuables, sometimes burying them on the bank. They would travel in convoys for safety, and if a bandit did attack, they would fight back with oars and poles, but they rarely won. The authorities did little to help. The canal was policed from a distance, but the patrols were infrequent. And yet, despite these dangers, the workers stayed, because the canal was their home. It was a hard home, but it was theirs. Let me describe one more scene. It is a cold winter night. The canal is frozen in patches. An old worker, Lee, is sitting alone in his sampan. His wife died years ago. His children have moved away. He is 60, old for a canal worker. His hands are gnarled, his back bent. He cannot pull ropes anymore. He stays alive by mending nets for the fishermen. He is poor, but he has enough. Tonight he is sitting by the stove, a small fire of charcoal. He is drinking warm wine. Outside, the wind blows. The ice creaks. He hears a sound, a baby crying. He looks outside. There's a basket on the bank, a baby wrapped in rags. Someone has abandoned it. Lee sighs. He gets up, walks shakily to the bank, picks up the basket. He brings it inside. The baby is cold, hungry. Lee feeds it some rice gruel. He wraps it in his own blanket. He will raise this child as he raised his own. It is what you do on the canal. You take care of each other. This story is not a historical fact. I do not know if such a thing happened, but it could have. It is the kind of small, quiet act that defined the canal workers' lives. They had little, but they shared what they had. They were not saints. They could be selfish, angry, tired, but in the moments that mattered, they were human. I could go on for hours. There are so many details to share. The tools they used, the songs they sang, the gods they worshipped. They had a god for everything. A god for the canal itself, often depicted as a dragon. A god for the locks, a fierce man with a beard. A god for the boats, a smiling woman. They would offer incense, food, and paper money to these gods. They would pray for safe passage, for good weather, for health. Their beliefs were a mix of Buddhism, Taoism, and older folk traditions. They did not understand the theology. They just needed someone to ask for help. Now, as we close this first part of our journey, I want you to picture yourself there. You are no longer in your room. You are on the bank of the Grand Canal in an evening long ago. The air is warm. The water is dark. You are sitting on a boulder, watching the boats pass. A worker walks by, leading a mule. He nods at you and you nod back. He is not a stranger. He is a part of this landscape. You stay there for a long time, listening to the water until the stars come out. Then you stand up, brush off your clothes, and walk back to your hut. You lie down on the straw mattress. You close your eyes. The sound of the canal is all around you. It quiets your thoughts. It rocks you to sleep. This is how the canal workers lived. Not in a world of dates and names, but in a world of sensation, of routine, of small moments. We will continue their story in another session, when we explore their songs, their festivals, and the changes that came with the passing centuries. For now, let the water stay with you. Let it carry you into a restful night. Good night. But wait, I said we would continue in another session. But tonight, I feel like sharing a bit more before you drift off. Perhaps the night is still young, and the canal is still flowing, and there is time for one more story, one more scene, one more gentle detail. So settle back, let the pillow cradle your head, and let me tell you about the festivals that lit up the Grand Canal like a string of paper lanterns stretched across the darkness. Imagine it is the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, the Dragon Boat Festival. The canal is alive with color and sound. Long, narrow boats, painted with scales and fierce dragon heads, race through the water. The rowers are canal workers, mostly young men with strong arms. They bend and pull in perfect unison, their oars splashing white foam. On the bank, families cheer, children wave flags, and old women sell sticky rice dumplings wrapped in bamboo leaves. The air smells of fresh zongzi and river mud, and the sweet smoke of incense. The workers have been preparing for weeks, practicing after their shifts, sanding the hulls of their boats, mending the oars. It is a rare moment of celebration in a life of hard labor. The festival is not just for fun. It is a ritual to honor the dragon gods who live in the canal. The workers believe that the canal is a living creature, a long serpent of water that breathes through the locks and gates. If the dragon is angry, it will cause floods or droughts. So they offer it sacrifices: steamed buns, chicken, and rice wine thrown into the water. They light firecrackers to scare away evil spirits. They pray for good year, safe passage, and full bellies. And then they feast. Whole roasted pig, fish fresh from the canal, vegetables from the fields, and plenty of rice. The workers eat until they are sleepy, then lie on the bank, watching the boats drift by. But the festivals are not all loud and bright. There are quieter ones too. The Ghost Festival, in the 7th month, is a time to remember the dead. The workers believe that the spirits of their ancestors return to walk along the canal. They light paper boats and set them adrift on the water, each one carrying a small candle. The canal becomes a river of tiny flames, flickering in the dark. The workers watch from their huts or sampans, speaking in whispers. They believe the spirits are thirsty, so they pour out tea and wine into the canal. They believe the spirits are hungry, so they leave bowls of rice on the bank. It is a tender, melancholic evening. The air is cool, the water dark, the flames drifting slowly until they disappear around a bend. One old worker, a man named Chen, used to tell a story about the Ghost Festival. He said that when he was a boy, he saw the spirit of his grandfather sitting on a rock by the lock. The grandfather was wearing his favorite blue tunic, the one he had been buried in. He was smoking a long pipe. Chen was terrified, but his mother told him to offer a cup of tea. He did, and the grandfather smiled, nodded, and vanished. Chen never forgot that night. He said it taught him that the dead are never far away on the canal. They are in the water, in the mist, in the sound of an oar dipping into the current. Let me tell you about the songs they sang. There were work songs for hauling barges, songs for mending nets, songs for lullabies. The most famous were the rolling songs, sung when a team had to pull a heavy boat through a shallow lock. One man would call out a line, and the others would answer. The rhythm matched the pull. Heave, and the rope tightens. Heave, and the boat inches forward. Heave, and the sweat drips into the water. The songs were simple, often repetitive, but they had a hypnotic quality. The men would fall into a trance, their bodies moving automatically, their minds free to wander. They would sing about oxen and plows, about girls with long black hair, about the emperor's concubines. It was a way to escape the boredom, the pain, the monotony. One such song that has been passed down in fragments goes like this: the water is wide, the water is deep, the rope is pulling, the boat does creep. The sun is high, the day is long, the worker sings his working song. It is not poetry by any measure, but when sung by 50 men in the early morning mist, it was like a chant, a prayer, a heartbeat. were the love songs. Young men and women working on opposite sides of the canal would sing to each other across the water. They would tease and flirt in rhyme. A young woman might sing, "The melon vine grows long and green. Who will pick it, who has seen?" A brave young man with steady hand to pull it from the muddy sand. And a young man might reply, "I do not want your melon sweet. I want your heart. I want your feet. To dance with me on festival night, under the moon and lantern light." These songs were like conversations, drifting across the water like petals. They were not always successful. Sometimes the woman would ignore him. Sometimes the man would sing off key and everyone would laugh. But sometimes a romance would bloom. A couple would meet at night by a willow tree. They would marry young, often with a simple ceremony on a boat. The bride would wear red. The groom would offer a cup of wine to the canal gods. And then they would live together on the sampan, their children growing up with the rhythm of the water. Now, I want to talk about the dark times, because the canal was not always gentle. There were floods that drowned entire villages. There were droughts that left the canal dry as a bone, the boats stuck in the mud, the workers idle and hungry. There were epidemics of cholera and fever that swept through the hut settlements. Whole families would fall sick, and there was no doctor. The workers relied on herbal remedies, on prayers, on the kindness of neighbors. Many died. The canal was a harsh mistress. I remember a story told by an old woman who lived near the city of Yangzhou. She said that her great-grandfather was a lock keeper during a terrible famine. The grain barges had stopped coming. The storehouses were empty. People were eating tree bark and grass. The great-grandfather had a small garden behind his lock house where he grew vegetables. He gave most of them away to hungry children. He slept with a stone for a pillow, so that if a thief came, he would wake up. He once found a man stealing a handful of rice from his storeroom. Instead of punishing him, he gave him a bowl of soup. He said, "We are all children of the canal. We must share." That famine did not last forever. The rains came, the barges returned, the canals filled. But the memory of those empty years stayed in the bones of the people. They built small shrines by the locks to thank the gods for mercy. They vowed to always leave a bowl of rice out for strangers. This tradition, known as canal hospitality, lasted for centuries. Even today, in some villages along the Grand Canal, you can find small offering tables by the water with dried fruit and incense. Let me describe the changing of seasons on the canal. Spring came with a green mist of willow leaves, with swallows dipping over the water, with the first cargo of fresh tea leaves. The workers would harvest the tender shoots from the patches of tea planted along the embankments. They would dry them in the sun, spread on bamboo mats. The air smelled of grass and earth. In summer, the heat was oppressive. The workers would work at dawn and dusk, sleeping through the midday under awnings. They would jump into the canal to cool off, splashing and laughing. The children would swim like fish. In autumn, the reeds turned gold, and the water reflected the orange of the setting sun. The workers would harvest rice, stacking the sheaves on the banks. They would brew millet wine, which which they stored in clay jars. In winter, the canal sometimes froze. The workers would break the ice with poles, or if the ice was too thick, they would stay inside, mending tools and telling stories. The cold wind blew through the cracks in the huts. They would huddle around a fire, wrapped in layers of padded cotton. Their fingers were chapped, their noses red, but they survived. There is a particular winter scene I love to imagine. A group of workers gathered in the largest hut, which belonged to the foreman. The foreman was a stout man with a scar on his chin, a gift from a rope that snapped during a storm. He was not a gentle man, but he was fair. Tonight, he is boiling a pot of mutton stew. The workers sit on the dirt floor, their backs against the wall, their hands cupped around bowls of steaming broth. They dip their flatbread into the soup. They eat slowly, savoring each bite. The fire crackles. The wind howls outside. One of the younger men, barely 17, pulls out a reed flute and begins to play a slow, sad melody. It is about a girl from Suzhou, with eyes like autumn pools. The men listen, their faces lit by the fire. Some of them close their eyes. One old man, his hair white, sheds a silent tear. He is thinking of his own wife, dead now 30 years. The music floats through the hut, out into the night, across the frozen canal. No one hears it except the stars. And then there is the memory of the great projects. The canal was not built in one go. It was dug, expanded, deepened, rerouted over centuries. The workers who built the original canal during the Sui dynasty were conscripted by the emperor. Thousands of them died from exhaustion, disease, and accidents. Their bodies were buried in the banks of the canal, so that the canal itself became a long grave. The workers we have been talking about, the ones living along the canal in later centuries, they knew this history. They would sometimes find old bones while digging a new drainage ditch. They would bury them again with a prayer. They believed that the spirits of those ancient workers still haunted the canal, especially on foggy nights. Some said they could hear the sound of picks and shovels, the groans of tired men carried on the wind. But the later workers did not dwell on death. They lived for the present. Their lives were humble, but they had dignity. They had their own customs, their own humor, their own wisdom. They knew that the canal would outlast them, that it would carry boats long after their own names were forgotten. And they accepted that. They did not seek fame. They sought a full bowl, a warm blanket, a good song. I remember one particular custom called night fishing with cormorants. Some workers owned trained cormorants, birds that dive into the water and catch fish. The fishermen would tie a string around the bird's neck so it could not swallow the fish. Then they would bring the fish up, take it from the bird's beak, and reward the bird with a small fish as a treat. This was done at night by the light of a lantern hanging on the boat. The workers would row silently, the birds perched on the gunwales. When the bird dove, the water would ripple with silver. The harvest was small, but it was enough for a family meal. Sometimes the children would help, holding the lantern, their eyes wide as they watched the birds. Now, as I speak, the hour grows late. The candle is low. I feel the drowsiness settling in my own bones. But before we truly sleep, I want to tell you one last scene. It is a story I heard from a canal scholar, a man who spent years collecting oral histories from the last generation of traditional boat people. It is 1938. The war is coming. The Japanese army is advancing. The canal is being used to transport refugees, not grain. A family, a father, a mother, 3 children, and an old grandmother is fleeing south on a sampan. They have packed their possessions: a bag of rice, some clothes, a few coins, a wooden statue of the canal god. The father is exhausted, his face gaunt. The children are scared. The grandmother is coughing. They travel at night with no lights to avoid detection. They hear gunfire in the distance. They see columns of smoke on the horizon. The water is choppy, the boat rocking. The mother holds the children close. The father paddles, his hands bleeding. The grandmother prays aloud, "Goddess of the boats, protect us." After 3 days, they reach a safe village. A farmer gives them shelter. The father weeps with relief. They will survive, but they will always remember the canal as their savior and their fear. But that is a sadder scene. Let me end with a gentler one. It is a summer afternoon, say 1810. A young boy is sitting on the bank, his feet dangling over the water. He is holding a bamboo fishing pole. His line is still. He is not really fishing. He is watching the boats go by, dreaming. He dreams of being a merchant or a sailor or a soldier. He does not know that he will spend his life as a canal worker, just like his father and his grandfather. But that is not a tragedy. He will find joy in his work. He will love a woman, have children, tell stories by the fire. And one day, many years later, he will teach his own grandson to fish from this same spot. And the canal will still be flowing. And so we return to the water that carries all stories, the water that has seen everything, the water that is still there, somewhere, moving slowly under the moon. I think I will leave you here for tonight. The story of the canal workers is not one that can be finished. It goes on in the memory of the people who still live along its banks, in the songs that are still sung, in the festivals that are still celebrated. But for now, let the image of the boatman, the lock keeper, the grain carrier, the old woman with the offering bowl, let them drift past your mind like boats on a quiet river. Let them rock you to sleep. Good night. And when you wake, the water will still be there, patient and deep, waiting for you to remember. But I know that sometimes sleep does not come easily. The mind wanders, and the heart longs for one more story. So let me tell you about the lock keeper who lived in a stone cottage beside the longest lock on the canal. His name was Old Chen, and he had been keeping that lock for 40 years. His beard was white as the foam on the water, and his hands were gnarled like the roots of an old willow. He knew every boat that passed, every captain, every cargo. He would greet them with a nod and a few words, sometimes a joke about the weather. He lived alone, except for a ginger cat that sat on the lock gate and watched the water with half-closed eyes. The lock itself was a marvel of simple engineering. 2 heavy wooden gates that opened and closed with a system of ropes and pulleys. When a boat approached, old Chen would turn the great iron wheel, and the gates would groan and swing open. The water would rush in or out, and the boat would rise or fall to meet the level of the next stretch. It took about 15 minutes for the whole process. Old Chen would sit on a stool during that time, smoking a long pipe, his eyes never leaving the boat. He could tell if a boat was carrying rice or silk just by the way it sat in the water. Could tell if the captain was in a hurry or relaxed by the way he waved. One evening, a boat came through with a cargo of porcelain. The captain was a young man, nervous, because the porcelain was fragile. He had tied the pieces in straw and stacked them carefully, but the canal was choppy that day. Old Chen noticed the boat was riding high, which meant the hull was light. He asked the captain if he had enough ballast. The captain shook his head, too proud to admit he had forgotten to add stones. Old Chen said nothing, but after the boat passed through the lock, he walked along the bank to a pile of rubble left from a collapsed wall. He picked up a few large stones, carried them to the next lock, and waited. When the young captain came through again the following week, old Chen handed him the stones. "These will steady you," he said. The captain tried to pay him, but old Chen refused. "Just bring me a small jar of your mother's pickled vegetables next time," he said. And so a friendship was formed. That is the kind of quiet kindness that threaded through the lives of canal workers. They did not have much, but they shared what they had. A bowl of soup, a handful of tea leaves, a spare rope. They helped each other when a boat got stuck in the mud, or when a child fell into the water. They knew that the canal was not a place for strangers. Everyone was connected by the water, like branches of the same tree. Now, let me speak of the women. The women who lived along the canal were as strong as the men, though their work was different. They washed clothes in the canal, beating them on flat stones. They carried water in wooden buckets balanced on poles across their shoulders. They tended small gardens of scallions, cabbages, and chilies behind the huts. They gave birth in the straw of their beds, with the help of a midwife who came by boat. I have read that the women often sang while they worked, a slow, rhythmic song that helped them keep time as they pounded the laundry. The song went something like this: "The water flows, the clothes grow clean, the sun shines on the village green." Each verse was a little different, sometimes about a handsome boatman, sometimes about a lost slipper, sometimes about the moon. One old woman I remember from a historian's account was named Auntie Leon. She lived in a small bamboo house that leaned a little to the left, just like her posture. She made reed mats for a living, weaving the reeds she cut from the canal banks. She would soak the reeds in water to make them pliable, then sit cross-legged on her porch, weaving them into mats that were sold to boatmen for sleeping on. She worked from dawn until dusk, her fingers moving like spiders. She had a scar on her thumb from a knife that slipped. She said the scar was her lucky mark because it reminded her of the day she met her husband, who had bandaged her thumb with a strip of his shirt. He was dead now, but she kept the memory alive in the mats she wove. She said every mat held a little bit of her story. The children, too, had their own world. They played on the banks, chasing dragonflies and catching frogs. They built small dams out of mud and watched the water pool behind them. They learned to swim before they could walk, or so it seemed. Their mothers would tie a gourd to their backs to keep them afloat, and they would paddle around like little ducks. Sometimes they would sneak onto a boat that was tied up for the night, pretending to be pirates or merchants. The boatmen would chase them off with a laugh. At night, the children would gather around the old storyteller, a man who had no teeth and a voice like gravel. He told tales of the canal dragon, a creature that lived in the deepest part of the canal and would only come out when the moon was full. The dragon, he said, had scales of jade and eyes of amber. It would surface and sing a song that sounded like the wind in the reeds. The children would shiver with delight, even though they knew it was just a story. But sometimes, on a foggy night, they would peer into the water and imagine they saw a gleam of green. And then there were the festivals. The most important was the Dragon Boat Festival, which fell on the 5th day of the 5th lunar month. On that day, the canal came alive with color. Boats were decorated with banners and flags, their prows carved in the shape of dragon heads. The workers would row in races, their oars dipping in unison, their drummers beating a fast rhythm. The spectators lined the banks, waving and shouting. The children would throw sticky rice dumplings wrapped in bamboo leaves into the water, an offering to the spirit of the poet Kuan, who had drowned himself centuries before. The workers would also hold a ceremony to thank the canal god for a safe year. They would set out a table with roast chicken, fruit, wine, and incense. The oldest worker would bow 3 times and chant a prayer. Then everyone would eat and drink until the sun went down. The canal was not just a workplace. It was a stage for joy. But I must also tell you about the quieter moments. The moments when the canal was empty and the water was still like a sheet of glass. The moments when a single egret stood in the shallow water, motionless, waiting for a fish. The moments when the mist rose from the water in the early morning and the world seemed to be made of soft gray shadows. The workers would pause in their labor just for a second to breathe in that silence. They would feel the weight of their lives lift just a little, and then they would go back to their work, but with a lighter step. There is a particular morning I want to describe. It is the morning after a heavy rain. The canal is swollen, the current fast. The workers are checking the embankments for damage. They walk along the top of the dike, poking the earth with sticks to see if it is soft. A young woman, maybe 20 years old, is carrying a basket of stones to patch a hole. She is pregnant, her belly round under her blue tunic. She walks carefully, her eyes on the ground. Her husband is ahead of her, digging mud with a shovel. They do not speak, but there is a rhythm between them. He digs, she drops a stone. He packs the mud around it. They have done this 100 times. Behind them, the canal churns with brown water. A log floats past, fast. The woman looks up for a moment, wipes her forehead with the back of her hand. The sun is coming through the clouds now, casting long shadows. She smiles just a little. She feels the baby kick. She thinks, this one will be a strong swimmer. I think often about that woman. She had no name in the records. She was just one of thousands of workers, invisible to history. But she was real. She had hopes and fears. She loved her husband. She dreamed of a better life for her child. And she stood on the bank of the Grand Canal, holding a basket of stones, with the water rushing past. That is enough. Now let me shift the scene a little. Let me tell you about the night watchmen. On certain stretches of the canal, there were watchmen who patrolled the banks at night. They carried a lantern and a wooden clapper. They would walk slowly, calling out the hour. 1 o'clock, all is well. 2 o'clock, all is well. Their voices echoed over the water. They were looking for leaks, for thieves, for fires. But mostly they were just present, a human heartbeat in the darkness. One old watchman, known as Big Nose Wang, had a habit of singing opera arias under his breath. He had a terrible voice, but he did not care. The water did not care either. It just flowed. One night, Big Nose Wang saw something strange. A light flickering on the water, moving slowly. He thought at first it was a boat, but it was too small, too dim. He walked along the bank, following it. The light stopped near a clump of reeds. He held up his lantern and saw a paper boat, the kind that children make, with a candle stub inside. It was floating on the current. Someone must have set it adrift upstream. It was a common practice, releasing a paper boat with a prayer to carry away bad luck. Big Nose Wang watched it until the candle sputtered out and the paper dissolved into the dark. He stood there for a long time, listening to the water. He thought about his own luck and his family far away. Then he clapped his clapper and called out, 3 o'clock, all is well. The sound rolled across the canal and was swallowed by the night. I could go on for hours. There is so much to tell. The way the workers built new locks, the way they dredged the silt, the way they repaired the stone walls, the way they used pulleys to lift heavy loads, the way they trained horses to tow boats along the towpath, the way they sang work songs to keep the rhythm, the way they gambled with dice made from chicken bones, the way they fell in love, and the way they grieved. But I think I will let you rest now. I will step back and let the images settle. Close your eyes. Imagine the sound of water lapping against the hull of a junk. Imagine the smell of wood smoke and frying fish. Imagine the feel of a rough blanket on a cool night. Imagine the distant sound of a flute, or a dog barking, or a baby crying. Imagine the weight of a day's work in your bones, and the relief of sinking onto a straw mat. Imagine the stars reflected in the canal, tiny pinpricks of light that seem to float on the surface. That is the world of the canal workers. It is not a world of grand monuments or famous battles. It is a world of small, repeated gestures, of hands that dig and carry and hold, of voices that call out in the dark, of lives that are lived in the shadow of the water, but are no less real for being humble. Perhaps tomorrow you will walk by a river or a creek, and you will think of them. Perhaps you will see a leaf floating downstream and remember that the same kind of water once carried the hopes of 1,000,000 workers. Perhaps you will feel a little more connected to the world. For now, sleep. Let the canal carry you into dreams. The water is still there, patient and deep, waiting for you to remember. And when you wake, the story will still be here, unfinished, like the canal itself. I will not wake you entirely. I will only add a few more scenes, like a gentle current that carries you a little further before letting you rest. You are already half asleep, I know. That is good. The story does not need your full attention. It only needs to be present, like the sound of distant thunder on a summer night. Let me tell you about the lock keepers. There were hundreds of them along the Grand Canal, each one stationed at a lock gate. Their job was simple, but it required patience and a steady hand. They would turn a wooden wheel, and the gate would open or close, letting the water rise or fall. They lived in small stone huts beside the locks, with a clay stove and a straw bed. They were often alone for days at a time, except for the occasional boatman who would stop to chat or trade a fish for a bowl of tea. One lock keeper I came across in the old records was a man named Liu. He had been at his post for 40 years. He knew the canal like the back of his hand. He could tell the time of day by the way the light fell on the water. He could predict the weather by the smell of the air. He had seen emperors pass by on their grand tour, their barges decked in silk and gold. He had seen famines when the water was low and the boats were empty. He had seen weddings and funerals, the same water reflecting joy and sorrow. Liu had a habit of talking to the fish. He would sit on the edge of the lock, dangling his feet above the water, and murmur to the carp that swam below. "Come here, old friend," he would say. "I have some crumbs for you." He would toss a piece of dry bread into the water, and the fish would nibble at it. He spoke to them as if they understood. Perhaps they did. After 40 years, Liu believed that the canal was alive, that it had a spirit that listened. When he turned the wheel, he thought he could feel the water breathing. One winter, the canal froze solid for 3 weeks. Liu was trapped in his hut with only a pile of firewood and a sack of rice. He did not mind the solitude. He had his pipe and his memories. He would sit by the fire and watch the frost creep across the window. He remembered his wife, who had died 20 years before. He remembered her laugh and the way she would hum while she cooked. He remembered the last time he held her hand on a night much like this one, with the wind howling outside. On the 15th day of the freeze, Liu heard a cracking sound. He went outside and saw that the ice was breaking up, piece by piece, like a puzzle coming apart. The water was returning dark and cold. He stood there for a long time, watching. Then he went back inside and lit a stick of incense for his wife. He placed it in a crack in the wall where he had kept a small shrine for years. The smoke curled up and disappeared into the gray sky. Liu felt a peace settle over him, as quiet as the snow. Now let me tell you about the food. The canal workers ate simply, but they ate well when they could. Their staple was rice, of course, cooked in a clay pot over an open fire. They would add vegetables like cabbage, radish, and small green beans. Sometimes they had fish, caught from the canal itself. On special days, they would have pork, stewed with soy sauce and star anise, the smell drifting across the water and making the boatmen hungry. There was a particular dish that the workers loved, a thick porridge made from leftover rice, with bits of salted fish and ginger. They called it canal porridge, and they ate it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was warm and filling, and it stayed in the belly like a comforting weight. The workers would eat it with their hands, scooping it up with a piece of flatbread. They would sit on the bank, their legs dangling, and watch the boats go by. They would talk about nothing important, just the weather and the work and the small events of the day. I remember reading a letter written by a worker to his mother. He described a meal he had shared with his comrades after a long day of dredging. He wrote, "We sat on the ground with the stars above us, and we ate from the same pot. The porridge was thick and salty, and we laughed about the leak we had fixed that morning. I have never tasted anything so good, because I was hungry and I was among friends." That letter survived because someone kept it in a box for 100 years. It is now in a museum under glass, but the taste is gone. The warmth is gone. Only the words remain. I want to tell you about the songs. The canal workers had a repertoire of work songs, each one suited to a particular task. There were songs for hauling ropes, songs for pumping water, songs for laying bricks. The melodies were simple, repetitive, like the rhythm of the work. The words were often humorous or bawdy, full of jokes about bosses and wives and the moon. The workers would sing them in a call and response style, one voice leading, the others following. There is one song that has been transcribed. It goes something like this: "Heave ho, pull the rope, the boat is heavy. Heave ho, the water is deep, the sky is wide. Heave ho, my back aches, but the canal is long. Heave ho, when will I see my home again?" Each verse ended with the same refrain: "The canal flows on, the canal flows on." It was not a sad song, exactly, but it carried a longing beneath the surface. The workers sang it to keep their spirits up, to share their burden, to remind themselves that they were not alone. There is another song, sung by the women who worked on the banks, carrying baskets of earth. It was softer, more like a lullaby. It went, little stone, where are you going? Down to the water to build a wall. Little stone, will you stay forever? Until the canal calls me home." The women would sing it to their children too, and the children would hum along. The melody was passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. It is lost now, like so many things. But I like to think that if you stand by the Grand Canal on a quiet night, you might still hear it, carried by the wind. Let me tell you a little about the seasons. The canal workers lived in rhythm with the year. In spring, they repaired the winter damage, patching cracks and clearing debris. The water was cold, and they worked with numb fingers. In summer, the heat was oppressive. The workers would strip to the waist and soak their heads in the canal. They would work from dawn until dusk, and then lie on the bank, panting, until the stars came out. In autumn, the work slowed. The harvest came, and many workers returned to their fields for a few weeks. The canal grew quieter, the water lower. In winter, the canal could freeze, and work stopped altogether. The workers huddled in their huts, burning wood and telling stories. They would make small repairs, mending tools and weaving baskets. They would wait for the thaw. There is a particular autumn evening I want to describe. The sun is setting behind the willows, casting long shadows on the water. The air is cool, and the leaves are turning yellow. A group of workers is sitting around a fire, roasting chestnuts. They are talking about a man named Zhao who has just died. He was old, maybe 70, and he had worked on the canal for 50 years. He had no family, no money. His only possession was a clay pipe, which he had carved himself. The workers are not sad, exactly. They are remembering. One of them says, "He could fix any lock, you know. He could hear a leak from 100 paces." Another says, "He used to tell that story about the ghost boat. Remember?" They fall silent, and the chestnuts crackle in the fire. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, is sitting on the edge of the group. He is Zhao's grandson. He has been given the clay pipe, though he does not smoke. He holds it in his hands, turning it over and over. He does not cry. He just listens to the men talk and watches the sparks rise into the darkening sky. Later, he will take the pipe to the canal and throw it in as an offering. But for now, he sits quietly, feeling the weight of the pipe and the weight of the night. I think about that boy often. Grew up to become a canal worker himself, like his grandfather. He had a son who also worked on the canal. And so it went for generations. The canal was not just a waterway. It was a lineage, a chain of hands that passed the work from one to the next. Each pair of hands was different, but they all touched the same stones, the same water. Now, let me tell you about the animals. The canal was full of life. Besides the fish, there were ducks and geese, herons and cranes, frogs and turtles. The workers kept dogs and cats. They raised chickens in coops on the roofs of their huts. They had a special fondness for water buffalo, which were used to drag heavy loads along the towpath. The buffalo were patient and strong, and they would stand for hours in the shallow water, chewing cud, their eyes half closed. One worker, a man named Sun, had a pet crow. He had found it as a fledgling, fallen from a nest. He raised it on bits of porridge and fish. The crow learned to speak a few words, or at least mimic them. It would sit on Sun's shoulder while he worked, and it would call out, "Rice, rice," whenever it saw a bowl. The other workers laughed at it, but Sun was fond of the crow, and it stayed with him for many years. When it died, Sun buried it on the bank, under a willow tree. He carved a small stone marker. "Here lies a friend." I will tell you one more story before I let you go completely. It is about a young woman named Lian. She lived on a boat with her family, transporting goods from one end of the canal to the other. Her father was the captain, her mother the cook. Lian helped with the ropes and the sails. She was 16, with a braid that reached her waist. She had never been to school, but she could read the river. She knew the currents, the shallows, the hidden rocks. She could steer the boat with one hand while holding a lantern with the other. One night, a storm came up suddenly. The wind howled, and the rain poured down in sheets. The canal turned into a chaos of waves. Lian's father was at the tiller, struggling to keep the boat steady. A wave hit the side, and he lost his footing. He fell into the water. Lian saw him go under. She did not hesitate. She grabbed a rope and dove in after him. The water was cold and dark. She could not see anything. She swam down, feeling for him. Her hand touched his arm. She grabbed it and pulled. She kicked with all her strength. She surfaced, gasping. Her mother threw the rope. Lian tied it around her father, and they hauled him aboard. He was alive. He coughed up water and lay on the deck, shivering. Leon sat beside him, her wet clothes clinging to her. She did not say anything. She just held his hand. Later, when the storm passed and the stars came out, her father said to her, "You are my daughter, but you are also the canal's child." Leon did not understand what he meant, not fully, but she felt it. The canal had given her back her father. It had tested her, and she had passed. Leon grew up to be a boat captain herself. She married a man from another boat. They had 3 children, all of whom learned to swim before they could walk. They lived on the water, and they died on the water. Their names are not in any history book, but the canal remembers. The water remembers. I could go on. I could tell you about the floods that washed away entire villages, and the way the workers rebuilt them, stone by stone. I could tell you about the bandits who preyed on slow boats, and the guards who chased them through the reed beds. I could tell you about the poetry written by scholars who traveled the canal and stopped to watch the workers, and the way they romanticized the labor. But I think you have heard enough for one night. The canal is still there, you know. It is still used, though not as much as before. Parts of it have been filled in. Parts of it are overgrown. But if you go to China, to a place like Hangzhou or Beijing, you can find a stretch of it. You can stand on the bank and watch the water flow. It is the same water that carried the boats of Liu and Lian and Big Nose Wang. It is the same water that lapped against the lock gates and froze in the winter. It is the same water that reflected the festivals and the fires and the faces of 1,000,000 workers. Maybe you will go there someday. Maybe you will stand on the bank and close your eyes. If you do, you might hear a very faint sound like a song. It is the song of the workers, carried from centuries ago, still humming in the current. For now, sleep. Let the canal carry you into dreams. The water is still there, patient and deep, waiting for you to remember. And when you wake, the story will still be here, unfinished, like the canal itself. I will say good night. The candle is burning low. The only sound is my voice and the distant lap of water. It is time to rest. Sleep well, and may the canal bring you peace. But perhaps I have let the story drift too quickly to its close. There are still a few quiet hours before dawn, and the canal has more to whisper. You may rest your head on the pillow, but I will keep speaking softly so that the words become part of the darkness around you. The canal is patient. It does not hurry to the sea. It meanders, and so shall we. Let me tell you about the songs the workers sang. They were not written down. They were passed from voice to voice, like the stories of ghosts and floods. There was a song for hauling a rope, a song for lifting a stone, a song for the evening meal. The words were simple, often repetitive, like a chant. One song went something like this: heave and pull, the boat goes slow, the river is full. Heave and pull, the day is long, the work is hard, but the night has a song. The rhythm matched the motion of their bodies. When they sang together, their movements became synchronized, and the work felt lighter. There was a song for the winter, too, when the canal froze, and they huddled around fires. It was a slow song about waiting for the spring, about the green shoots that would come, about the returning geese. The old men would sing it in a low, raspy voice, and the younger ones would listen and learn. I think about a particular evening in late autumn when the leaves had fallen and the sky was the color of ash. A group of workers had gathered in a hut that was used for storage. It was crowded, but the warmth of their bodies and the small fire made it cozy. One of them, a man named Chen, had a flute. He had carved it from bamboo, and he played it softly, a tune that sounded like the wind through the reeds. The others were silent, listening. A woman named May began to hum, then to sing. Her voice was low and clear. She sang about a place she had never seen, a village in the mountains where her grandmother was born. She sang about the plum blossoms and the snow, about a stream that ran through the bamboo grove. No one in that hut had ever been to such a place. They had only known the canal, the flat land, the mud, but her song made them feel it almost. They closed their eyes, and for a moment they were there. And then the song ended. The fire crackled. Someone added a log. Chen put down his flute. They sat in silence, not wanting to break the spell. Finally, the oldest worker, a man named Wu, spoke. He said, "In my grandfather's time, there was a singer who traveled the canal. He would come to the work camps and sing for a bowl of rice. He knew all the old songs. He knew ones about the emperors and the generals, but he also knew the ones about the common people, like us. He sang about a lock keeper who fell in love with a ghost. He sang about a boat that could fly. People said he had learned the songs from a spirit who lived in the water. I don't know if that's true, but when he sang, you believed it." The workers nodded. They had heard of the traveling singer. Some of them thought he was still alive somewhere, an old man with a white beard, still singing by the canal. They liked to imagine that. It made the world feel larger, more magical. Now, let me tell you about the festivals. The canal workers did not have much, but they celebrated when they could. The most important festival was the spring festival, of course. They would try to travel home to their families, if they had any, but many did not. So they celebrated together. They would clean the huts, hang red paper cutouts on the doors, and make dumplings. They would use the best ingredients they had, sometimes with pork and cabbage, sometimes just vegetables. They would boil the dumplings in a big pot over an open fire, and each person would get a few. There were not many, but they ate slowly, savoring each bite. After the meal, they would tell stories. The best storyteller was a man named Jin, who had a scar on his cheek from a fight with a bandit. He told tales of the Monkey King and the White Snake, but he also made up his own. One year, he told a story about a canal worker who found a magical stone that could grant wishes. The worker wished for a new boat, but the stone made the boat out of clouds, and it floated away. He wished for a warm coat, but the coat was made of sunlight, and it burned. He wished for a wife, but the wife was made of water, and she melted. The moral, Jin said, was to be careful what you wish for, especially if you are a canal worker. The others laughed, but they also thought about it. There was another festival in the summer called the Dragon Boat Festival. On the canal, they would race boats, not the long dragon boats of the south, but the small working boats, decorated with paper flowers and ribbons. The winners would get a bottle of rice wine and a prize of fish. The workers would line the banks, cheering. The children would run alongside. It was a day of noise and laughter, a break from the endless work. And when it was over, they would go back to their tasks, but the memory of the race would linger for weeks. I want to tell you about the food, too. The canal workers ate simply. Their staple was rice, of course, but they also had vegetables, pickled cabbage, salted fish, and sometimes pork or chicken. They made a kind of porridge in the morning, thin and watery, with a few vegetables thrown in. For the midday meal, they would have rice and a simple stir-fry if they had oil. In the evening, they would eat the leftovers, or make a soup from bones and wild greens. They drank tea, weak and bitter, from clay cups that were chipped and stained. But there were treats. During the harvest, they would get fresh fruit, apples and persimmons, and sometimes a melon. They would share it, cutting it into thin slices. The sweetness was a shock, a moment of pure pleasure. They would close their eyes and let the juice run down their chins. And there was the wine, too, made from rice or millet, drunk during festivals or after a particularly hard day. A man named Liu, the one who could fix locks, used to say that a cup of wine was worth an hour of sleep. He drank his wine slowly, holding it in his mouth before swallowing, as if savoring the warmth. I think about the beds they slept on. They were simple platforms of wood, covered with straw and a rough blanket. In the winter, they would huddle together for warmth, 3 or 4 to a platform. They would lie on their sides like spoons and listen to the wind outside. Sometimes they would talk in low voices about their families, about the past. But most of the time they just slept, exhausted, their bodies sinking into the straw. The dreams they had were ordinary, I imagine. They dreamed of food, of warm places, of the faces of loved ones. They did not dream of the canal, because the canal was always there, even in sleep. Now I will tell you about a particular night, one that I think about often. It was a night in early spring when the ice had just melted. The canal was swollen with meltwater, and the current was strong. A group of workers was tasked with repairing a damaged lock gate. They worked by torchlight, the flames reflecting in the black water. It was cold, and their hands were numb. They worked in silence, each knowing what to do. One of them, a young man named Ping, was holding a rope that was attached to a heavy timber. The rope was wet, and it slipped. The timber swung, hitting him in the chest. He fell into the water. The current caught him, pulled him under the gate. Others shouted through ropes, but it was too dark, too fast. He did not surface. They found his body the next morning, tangled in reeds a mile downstream. They brought him back to the camp, washed him, dressed him in his best clothes. They built a small coffin from scrap wood. They buried him on the bank under a willow tree. The oldest worker said a few words, but there was no ceremony. They just stood there, looking at the grave. Then they went back to work. The lock gate still needed repairing. That night the workers sat in silence. No one sang. No one told stories. The fire burned low. Someone said, "He was only 19. That was all." They went to sleep, and the next day they finished the lock gate. Life went on. The canal did not stop for death. It kept flowing, carrying the water that had taken Ping, carrying boats and fish, carrying all the stories. But the memory of Ping stayed with them. Years later, when a new worker joined the camp, someone would point to the willow tree and say, "That's where Ping is buried. He died in the spring." The water was cold, and the new worker would nod, and the story would pass on. I think about all the Ping S, all the unknown workers who died along the canal. Their names are not recorded. Their graves are unmarked or long gone. But the canal itself is a kind of monument. Every stone, every lock, every bend in the water is a testament to their labor. They built it with their hands, their backs, their lives. And the canal carries them still, in its flow, in its silent presence. There is something else I want to mention, something about the silence of the canal. At night, when the work stopped and the voices faded, the canal was not completely quiet. There was the lapping of water, the creak of boats, the distant sound of a dog barking. But there was also a deeper silence, a kind of listening. The workers felt it. They would sit by the water and just listen, as if the canal was speaking to them. They did not understand the words, if there were any, but they felt heard. They felt that the canal knew them, their sorrows and their joys, their tired hands and their aching backs. I remember a story an old worker told me, though it is not my own memory. He said that once, a long time ago, a worker named Song was sitting by the canal, late at night, unable to sleep. He had lost his wife to illness a year before, and he was still grieving. He sat on the bank, looking at the water. He began to speak to her, telling her about his day, about the work, about the little things. He did not expect an answer. But then, he said, the water rippled, and a voice came from the ripples, soft as a whisper. It said, "I am here." He looked down, and he saw her face in the reflection, or thought he did. He reached out, but the reflection broke apart. He sat there until dawn, and he never told anyone about it, except the old worker who told me. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was the grief playing tricks. But Song felt better after that, and he stopped being so sad. He believed she was with him, in the canal, in the water that carried his boat every day. I will not say if that story is true. It does not matter. The canal is a place where such things can happen, where the boundary between the living and the dead, between memory and water, becomes thin. The workers knew this. They had rituals. They would pour a little wine into the canal before drinking, as an offering. They would toss a coin in when they passed a certain bend, to ensure safe passage. They would whisper to the water when they were alone. And then there were the superstitions. Never point at a boat with your finger, or it will sink. Never whistle at night, or you will attract spirits. Never step over a rope with your left foot first. The workers followed these rules without thinking. They were woven into the fabric of their daily lives, as real as the mud and the stone. And when something went wrong, they would say, "Someone broke a rule," and they would try to fix it with a small offering or a prayer. Now I am growing quiet, and the night is deep. The candle has burned down to a stub. I can smell the wax, the smoke. Outside, the wind has died. The canal is still, reflecting the stars, I want to leave you with one last image. It is of a single worker, a woman named Lee, who lived on a barge with her husband and children. She was old now, her back bent, her hands gnarled. She sat on the deck of the barge, sewing a patch onto a sail. The needle moved slowly, carefully. Her grandchildren played nearby, throwing stones into the water. She looked up at the sky, which was turning pink with the dawn. She sighed, not with sadness, but with a kind of contentment. She had spent her whole life on this canal. She had seen it change, the boats change, the people change, but the water remained. She thought about her mother, who had also been a boat woman, and her grandmother before that. They were all connected by this water, this endless flow. She finished the stitch, tied the thread, and bit it off. Then she called the children to come eat breakfast. It was rice porridge with a few pieces of dried fish. They ate in silence, the only sound the gentle slosh of water against the hull. That is the life of the canal workers. It is not grand. It is not in history books. It is slow and patient and full of small moments. And when I think about it, I feel a deep calm, like the calm of the water at dusk. I hope you feel it too. I will end here. The story is not finished, but stories never are. The canal is still flowing, somewhere in the world, carrying the water that carries the memories. Sleep now. Let the gentle current of these words carry you into your dreams. The canal is patient. It will be there when you wake, waiting to tell you more. Good night. Sleep well. But before you drift off completely, let me share one more small moment. One that happened many years after the canal was built, when the workers had long since become part of the landscape. There was an old man named Chen who had worked on the canal since he was a boy. He was 90 now, and his eyes were clouded with age. He lived in a small hut near the lock where he had once labored. Every evening, he would walk to the edge of the water slowly, leaning on a stick. He would sit on a flat stone and watch the boats pass. The boatmen would wave, and he would nod. He knew many of them, or their fathers, or their grandfathers. He had seen generations go by like the water. One evening, a young boy came to him. The boy was curious. He had heard stories about the old man, about how he had helped build the canal. "Is it true you moved stones as big as a horse?" the boy asked. Chen laughed, a dry, rustling sound. "No," he said, "not as big as a horse, but big enough. We moved them with ropes and levers, and with our backs. We moved them for years." The boy sat down beside him. "Were you ever afraid?" he asked. Chen thought for a long time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. "Yes," he said finally. "I was afraid many times, afraid of the dark, of the cold, of the water, afraid of the rocks falling, afraid of the foreman's whip. But you learn to be afraid and still work. Fear becomes just another thing you carry, like a stone in your pocket." The boy was quiet. Then he asked, "What did you do when you were scared?" Chen looked at the canal. The water was smooth, reflecting the orange sky. "I would look at the water," he said. "I would watch it flow. And I would think, this water has been flowing for 1,000 years. It has seen everything. It does not stop. It does not rush. It just goes. And I would tell myself I can be like that. I can just keep going slowly, patiently, like the water." The boy nodded, though he did not fully understand. They sat together until the stars came out. Then the boy's mother called him home. He stood up, said thank you, and ran off into the dusk. Chen stayed a little longer. He felt the cold stone beneath him, the gentle breath of the wind. He thought about all the boys he had seen, all the workers who had come and gone. He was old and tired and ready, but the canal was not ready. It would flow on, carrying the water, carrying the memories, carrying the stories that no one would ever tell. He stood up with difficulty and walked back to his hut. He lay down on his bed, a pile of straw and old cloth. He closed his eyes. He heard the water lapping against the lock, soft and steady. It was the sound of his whole life. He fell asleep, and in his dreams, he was young again, lifting stones, laughing with his friends, feeling the sun on his back. That is the last story I will tell you tonight. The old man is gone now, and the hut is gone, and the lock has been rebuilt. But the canal is still there, and somewhere at this very moment, a worker is sitting by the water, looking at the stars, thinking about the day. And the water is flowing as it always has, as it always will. So let that be your final thought. The canal does not need us to remember it. It remembers itself. It holds everything in its depths, every stone, every breath, every dream. And when you close your eyes tonight, you might feel it, a gentle current, a quiet pulse carrying you into the darkness. Sleep now. Rest your tired thoughts. The canal will watch over you silently, patiently, until morning comes. Good night.